Pentecost. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the second Sunday after the Pentecost for the week of June 7th, 2026. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast. And boy, it's amazing that we are already in June as we are getting into these texts, going into them. And this is kind of a transition week, I feel like. We're gotten through Pentecost and having that. Now we have this huge season of after Pentecost. And this is where we'll kind of dig a little bit more into the meat and potatoes, if you want to say that, of Matthew here over the next multiple months as we're kind of going through these texts. And I think it's an important kind of like moment where there is some major transition that is going on. We're going to go back and kind of walk through Jesus's ministry and understanding from Matthew's perspective how this is all working, how this is all coming together. And I think it's important for us as we are looking at the church year and talking about the church year to kind of understand a little bit on how is this all being laid out, because without that, it gets a little bit hard to navigate and understand why are we in the place that we are in. We also then need to look back to the question that we had for last week, which was, where do you see in your life that you have been built upon? And it's been interesting. I don't have kids, but I got some responses this week looking to their kids and seeing how there's different attributes of themselves and how those attributes are being passed on, and looking at sometimes even personalities or things that they're looking at doing. The one person this week reached out and talking about how they're a volunteer type of person. They're the person who wants to help others, and seeing how in his sons that he has seen this continue to be passed on. And I think it's an important attribute for us to remember. I know, like I've kind of brought up, there's some different things going on within my wife's side of the family, and that's been one of the things we've been talking about a lot, is how do you carry on? How do you take what your grandmother did and be able to move it to the next generation or generations beyond, so that in certain ways she does not die, but lives through you and through the others that you continue to pass that along to. And I think with how we should be thinking about talking about faith, I think that's an important thing for us to be remembering, is how do we show, how do we present, how do we enable people to walk into this ministry and walk into their ministry, and understanding that it's being built upon others. Like we've talked about multiple times before with science being built upon itself, how do we look at ourselves within faith that we're continuing to build upon each other? So let's just jump into it this week. This is where we get into, now we have semi-continuous Old Testament text. So we're going to have a few more readings now for the next few months, at least, as we're kind of going through this. So one of the possible Old Testament texts that you can have is from Genesis chapter 12, the first 9 verses of it. This is kind of the beginning of how God is talking to Abram, who becomes Abraham, and the blessing of what God is planning on laying out for Abram. He is 75, and he's telling him and his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot to gather all their possessions and to move to a new land, and that your offspring will be given this land of Canaan. So this recognition on how God is laying out the beginnings of what the plan is going to be, but the trust that Abram has to have with God to be able to pick up everything and move. And I know, especially as a person who hasn't moved a lot in their life, that is difficult to pick up everything and to move. The psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 33, all 12 verses of that. And it's recognizing how we should be giving God this praise. We should be acknowledging how God continues to love us, how God continues to provide for us, and how all of this is done so that we are able to be in relationship with God. And in doing that, then there's the healthy fear, because we recognize how much God is in control of things. that God can frustrate people because it's God's will is done. It's not our will is done. But as we align ourselves with what God is wanting us to be able to do, being able to steer us toward where God is wanting us, this is where the true joy, the happiness, the ability to be able to live up to who God has created us to be comes through. The other Old Testament text we can have this week is from Hosea chapter 5, starting in verse 15 through chapter 6, verse 6. We have to remember that Hosea is kind of trying to, after the breaking apart of Israel into the two parts, but it's trying to remind the people to come back to God, otherwise things are going to become more difficult, is basically what we are in the middle of here. And we are reminded here of how God has provided all these things. We especially can see that in like verse 3 of chapter 6. Let us press on to know the Lord. His appearing is as sure as the dawn. He will come to us like the rain, like the spring rains that water the earth. How God continues to sow after them, continues to be after them, and yet the people have continued to kill the prophets, have continued to turn away from God, and yet what is the reasoning behind this? The steadfast love that God has for us. Not the burnt offerings of what we can do to these other gods. It's this recognition how God loves us. The psalm that goes with that then this week is Psalm 50, starting in verse 7 through 15. And this is a psalm of recognizing yet again how God has continued to not want these burnt offerings, not want all these other things. What God is desiring is for us to be able to acknowledge God and to have the sacrifice of thanksgiving and giving God glory in that, to call upon the Lord in our time of trouble so that God can glorify our situation. God created all the different things that we would be sacrificing. Why is God needing them? Is part of what we get there in the middle of that selection from Psalm 50. The Roman text then this week, which is Romans chapter 4, verses 13 to 25, builds upon what we see in Genesis. This recognition on how Abraham and the descendants, through the law and through the righteousness of following in God's footsteps, were able to get closer to what God is wanting. But it's not necessarily this following blindly of the law. What God is wanting is faith. And that all of this is based on faith. The recognition and belief that God is in control and that God has your best intentions in mind. And so thus, we are going to continue to lean into that. We are going to continue to strive for that. And in doing that, that is what will bring us closer to God. And in doing that, we will be able to become closer to the people of God. This is not something that weakens our faith, but it strengthens our faith. And you look at how Abraham continued to double down on multiple different issues, how God continued to provide even though Sarai didn't look like she was going to be able to give a child, and yet God said, whatever you think is impossible, I can make possible. And so thus, the faith that we need to have to be able to recognize that, acknowledge that, and live that out is a whole nother thing. The gospel text in this week is out of Matthew, starting in chapter 9, verse 9 to 13 and 18 through 26. We start here with Jesus calling Matthew to come and follow him. And there's a lot of other tax collectors and people around, so the Pharisees start asking questions of Jesus. Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? As they're kind of directing that semi toward Matthew. And when Jesus heard this, he stated, "Those who are well have no need for a physician, but those who are sick, go and learn what it means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have come not to call the righteous, but the sinners. Then we have a gap here where there was some questions about fasting and why Jesus' followers didn't fast, which is omitted from the text this week. And then we get a couple healing stories here starting in verse 18, where we have a man coming to Jesus and recognizing that his daughter had just died and believing that if he laid hands on her, she would live. Jesus gets up and follows him with his disciples. There is a woman there, starting in verse 20, that has been suffering probably from something like a hemorrhage. It's stating a flow of blood for 12 years. And she touches the fringe of his cloak and is under the impression that if I touch it, I will be made well. Jesus turns and recognizes this when this happens. Take heart, daughter, for your faith has made you well. That woman was made well from that moment on. Jesus then continues to the house where they're having this basically funeral service. He commissions them to go away, that the daughter is but sleeping. They laugh at him. When they are outside, he ends up having the daughter get up and is able to be healed, and this then spreads throughout the whole district. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug. Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts or commentaries or discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, have some different biblical teaching come in, having different biblical commentaries, having different ideas and things to be thinking about. And especially if you're a pastor, there's whole sections kind of talking about the craft of preaching and kind of digging into that a little bit further. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Reading Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, along with prayers, hymns, colors, daily readings to get you into the text to help with this. But like we've been talking about, the art is another important part. They have a whole new website looking at the Christian tradition in art and are looking for feedback. So I'd highly recommend checking that resource out down below, the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Reading Library, and you will see the whole announcement there talking about the art section if you want to check that out. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies, going through the weekly text, along with a lot of other great ecologically focused material. If you enjoy listening to this podcast for a half an hour each week, I know you're going to enjoy digging into some of the different things that are over there. So I'd highly recommend checking out the first link down in the references section to check out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out Beyond the Argument, Where Science and Scripture Meet by Isang Nadali Teddy. It is a great kind of essay form, kind of taking on why are we seeing faith and science in competition when really they come together and work beautifully together. He does a great job at being able to kind of go into this text and thinking about things at more of a high level, but going through it in a way that presents it and shows how they really are working together. I'd highly recommend, if you haven't checked this out, it's the second link in the show notes. It's a great read. It's a fast read, but a solid read and worth spending a little bit of time checking that out. This week in the text, we are seeing in multiple places trust coming through, with Abram being able to pull together everything that he has and being able to move to where God is calling him. Hosea calling out the people saying, you do not trust God. Do you not trust God? Do you not see how God has continued to provide for you? You have killed all these prophets. When are you going to be able to trust so that the love of God is being able to be shared with you? The Romans text going into and discussing how it was not the law abiding, it was the faith that made the difference, and that's what we should be going after. That's what we should be striving for. And we see that even in the text this week, where Matthew is starting to get kind of questioned along with Jesus on what is going on. Why are you following this guy? The testosterone you could almost hear coming from the Pharisees this week. And then we have this completely different aspect in the second half of the reading, starting in verse 18, where you have this father coming and my daughter is sick and has died. Jesus, help her. We have this woman who is then trusting that if I can just touch the hem of his cloak, I will be healed. And we get these things discussing how Jesus, it's your faith that has made you well. It is the faith that they believed in something greater than themselves that Jesus reacts, and we get these healings. And there's a reason that I called out the testosterone of the Pharisees, because we'll get into that, because there's some science that we're going to get into talking about this. But I think it's really important for us to be able to acknowledge and recognize this right away. We have this group who thinks they are in control and then questioning anything that isn't what they would expect or what they would do. And yet then we have this group of people who are believing in something greater than themselves, believing that something is going to happen. And it's their faith that makes them well. Paul Zaks had a TED Talk a little over about 15 years ago. And in the talk, he is stating, I have figured out the hormone that he quotes as the moral molecule. I have figured out what is the thing that helps us as humans and mammals in general be different than the rest of creation. Oxytocin. Oxytocin is a naturally occurring molecule within our bodies. It helps us feel good. And as Paul Zaks talks about in his study, and we'll walk through it a little bit here, it helps with trust. It helps with morality. It helps with changing our behavior in a natural way to be more collaborative, and more caring, and more empathetic. And empathetic people is what we're striving for, because we can see that in Jesus's work in general. So what Zaks did, and he did this multiple times, the hard thing with oxytocin is the half-life of oxytocin is about 3 minutes. So you don't have a lot of time to work with. You can notice it in the blood, so you have to get quick blood draws to be able to look at that. And basically, they did multiple different studies, but probably his initial one that was really a thing is that he had these groups of people together that were randomly paired together. Zaks came to this person and would say, okay, we're giving you $100. You can take from that $100 and give it to this other person you have never met. Would you be willing to do that? And there was a good section of people that would do that. What gets interesting then is then the second person gets told, yes, you're going to get this $100, but another person has given you X amount of dollars. The person that matched with them and the amount that they gave. And a lot of times that person would then say, well, can I give some back to them? There's no rationale within our brains. If someone is giving you something, why are you then giving some of it back immediately? And what he was able to find is it's this release of oxytocin that is part of this. And it's a molecule that seems to be about bringing people together and trying to unite people together. One of the ways that he was able to kind of show this was looking at marriages, getting some blood samples before a wedding and right after the vows, and recognizing how the bride was obviously the highest oxytocin, the mother of the bride second, the father of the groom was in there, the groom. But it's this recognition of all this oxytocin being released helps to bring people together, be more empathetic, that we're trying to come together. And what is that doing? It's building trust. It's building this community in front of our eyes. Now, in the research that Paul Zaks did, he stated there was a couple things that they noticed that inhibited oxytocin. They found that 5% of people do not produce oxytocin on stimulus. This aspect that just certain people, for whatever reason, they can produce it in other situations, but some type of stimulus like that does not allow them to create oxytocin. This can be an early indicator to some other kind of weirder mental health issues that can get into, but it isn't uncommon. We're still talking 5% of the population. He also found that if there was some improper nurturing throughout their life, that this can directly impact this, say sexual abuse or things of that nature, which then could drastically reduce or prevent them from releasing oxytocin with stimulus like that. Another one that was found was high stress reduces and makes it very difficult for the body to be able to produce oxytocin with the stimulus. And finally, testosterone. High testosterone kind of trumps oxytocin. And this is where in different studies he found that people with high testosterone, instead of giving the money away, were trying to actually hoard the cash more and more. Thus my earlier comment. But this idea of how if I'm in control, then why do I need to trust anyone else? There are things though within our communities that we naturally do that help release oxytocin for all of us. And it's hugs. Hugs are a natural release of oxytocin. And it makes a lot of sense because when you are hugging somebody, there is trust. It helps in those situations when things are hard to make it feel like the world is understanding me and connecting with me, at least in some level. There is some morality to the world in which we're living in, even though I may or may not be having a good day. It brings us and unites us together. Let's look back then at these texts again, especially the gospel text. Your faith has made you well. Your faith has made you well. Your trust has made you well. Your belief has made you well. Your decision to trust and take action has made you well. This woman and this man believed that. They used that oxytocin to be able to have this trust, and Jesus reassures it. When we look at these texts, even in the Hosea text where it's a warning text, do you not recognize what God is doing for you? But especially in Genesis and Romans, this recognition of trust that is necessary and desired. When we're looking at the Psalms and giving praise, it's acknowledging the trust of what God has done for us, and thus we should be acknowledging that as well. We need to become and acknowledge that naturally within our bodies, within mammals, we can release oxytocin. It's one of the things that makes mammals unique, and it allows us to have some of what it's doing is allowing us to start having emotions. We need to have emotions. We need to be able to express ourselves. We need to be able to do that. And we need to be able to, as communities, embrace that, acknowledge that, empathize with that, which means we need to embrace the feeling of oxytocin. And especially as a man, we need to be able to at times reduce our testosterone so that we can feel other things that are going on within us. And I would argue what we are seeing in this gospel text reiterates that as well. We can become the biggest obstacle from what God is trying to do. And it naturally within us, He has created a molecule to build trust, to have empathy, to have morality, if we are willing to acknowledge it, feel it, sense it. It's important for us to do this. It's important for us to acknowledge this. Before I started the podcast, and one of the things that kind of led up to the podcast, if you follow the United States news, I distinctly remember in 2018 was the Las Vegas shootings at a music concert, if I'm remembering correctly. And I remember going into work and I had heard about it, and I'm sitting there, and one of the things that was hard for me is, why am I not feeling this? And it was a question that I had for myself that I couldn't understand. Understanding this research, part of it was I was under a lot of stress, but part of it is also I kind of hardened myself to it as well. And I think as humans, and especially as male, we have to allow ourselves to be soft, to be able to feel things. Because this idea of the rough and tough man might actually be hurting our trust and morality with other people. And that's, I would say, for many of us, that's not what we're desiring. And what this shows me is what Jesus is actually trying to get at, and part of what our faith should be about is that we have to be vulnerable. We have to be able to acknowledge this part of ourselves and acknowledge that this is how we were designed. Because all of us can produce oxytocin. Some of us easier than others, but it's still there. The instructions are there. We all can do it. And yet, when we do that, it actually brings us together. And I find that beautiful. Because is that not a way that our faith is making us well? I think so. So the question I have for you this week is, knowing this now about oxytocin, when was the last time you really let oxytocin take hold? When was the last time you let oxytocin take hold? The half-life is 3 minutes. It's not like it's a very long thing, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge this within ourselves and allow ourselves to be vulnerable. The woman who was bleeding was vulnerable. The Father going to Jesus saying that was being vulnerable. The Pharisees were not. The Pharisees were finding things to be critical of instead of being vulnerable. And I know for myself, it's a lot easier to be critical than allowing ourselves to be open, honest, and vulnerable. We, for whatever reason, feel that we need to be protective of that and not allow ourselves to do that. But I would argue when we look at this text and these texts, I think that's showing that maybe that's not always what God intends. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.